Yo, what's up lads, you with the Budget Monk, and welcome to a new video here. I wanted to talk about in this video why mercenaries are bad and why I don't use them very often at all. Sometimes once or twice per game, but most of the time not at all. When we're playing a big hardcore game like this with a really try-hard goal in mind, guys, whenever I run out of manpower on my stream, people ask me, why don't I hire mercenaries? And I find myself too often responding to that question. Hopefully this video can serve the purpose of being linked to when people ask me that question. But with that being said, why are mercenaries terrible? Let's go over a few reasons why they are. Number one is that you might not know this, and that's no fault of your own. It's basically Paradox's fault because it doesn't say it anywhere. But when you hire a mercenary stack, it costs you 5 professionalism. Yes, 5 professionalism. So it also costs you 5 professionalism to slacken standards. So provided that it is that you have manpower, or professionalism rather, you can actually slacken standards for 58,000 manpower in this case, instead of hiring the mercenary stack, which is going to give you about 60,000 units. So ironically, provided that you have professionalism, mercenaries actually cost you manpower. Go figure. So if you're out of manpower, you spend manpower to hire mercenaries. And by that I mean stored up manpower in your professionalism. Now, of course, they do come along with their own manpower pool, but it's quite terrible, and we're going to get to reasons why that is the case. But I just want to throw that out there. In many cases, guys, if you're playing against the AI in particular, you often are only going to have 1 or 2 military ideas. And what that means is that if you have a good power projection, good advisors, and so on, you're often going to be ahead in your military points in the late stages of the game, giving you the ability to hire generals with your excess military points, which gives you 1 professionalism a pop, meaning that in my case, 5 generals gives us 58,000 manpower, and that's typically where you're going to resource most of your manpower in the late game of EU4, is basically from your professionalism. Professionalism itself has some pretty good modifiers, guys, if you actually mouse over it, if you read what it does, and just throwing it away for mercenary stacks is not a good idea in my opinion. With that being said, you can obviously hire like the Free Company Militia in the beginning of the game if you are playing a nation that begins with 0 professionalism without that professionalism cost, and in many cases I do recommend doing that, although there are some downsides to that as well, just because mercenaries are so terrible. But with that being said, the next thing we're going to talk about is the size of the units. You can see each one of these units here, the mercenaries, is 60,000. Now this is obviously going to fluctuate throughout the course of the game, but I assure you that they are just simply way too large. So with the current dynamic, guys, if 1 mercenary stack costs you 5 professionalism, then in a way you're going to want the largest mercenary stack you could possibly get, right? You don't want to hire multiple small ones. But they could reduce the cost. Let's say if these were each 30,000 a pop, guys, and cost 2.5 professionalism, the first point would still be exactly the same, right? But yet it would be an improvement on the second point, which is they are too large. So if we go to the map mode here of supply limit, we can see just how large 60,000 actually is. Now take note really quickly of my stacks are all composed of 40,000 for a reason, and it's very typical to experience attrition here on your unit. Well, if we look at the supply limit, we can see that in most cases 40,000 is pretty good. And what we do is we have 2 stacks going around together, and we merge them together to overkill the combat width. But if we look at 60,000, you can see with the exception, even in grasslands, guys, in grasslands provinces, you can see, but with the exception of the largest farmlands provinces in our country, you will actually be suffering attrition at any given time anywhere else with those mercenary stacks. It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. 90% of anywhere that you are, you will just be suffering attrition. And the mercenary stack will basically just be declining and bleeding out, and therefore its own manpower pool is just declining and bleeding out. It's absolutely terrible, and that's, of course, not even to mention combat. They're so bad, they just literally just proceed to die. It's terrible. The next reason mercenaries are bad is because of their composition. So we can see at best here that we can get 19 cannons in the stack. 19. Well, if we look at our combat width, which is, it's only 36, 19 cannons is absolutely fine. I have 2k in mine currently. But the difference with my stacks, guys, is when we take an engagement, I have two which I combine together. So the mentality that I have is that I have one super stack, aka two stacks, and we keep them as two stacks to avoid the latest mentioned issue, which is a supply limit stuff, right? We keep them as two different stacks. They also overkill the amount of cannons required to be on a fort. So typically I would send one in to siege the fort and the other one as backup. But you kind of have two operating. Well, with that being said, by that logic, the best stacks here in terms of cannons have half the cannons you would want. Or if you have the logic of combining two together, you can see just how absurdly inefficient it is in the front row. You will end up having like 4 times as many front row units as needed if you have two stacks going around side by side. The composition is just absolute garbage. So that is like the third reason why. It should go without saying, guys, that cannons are extremely powerful. It's a little bit misunderstood, even within, the Tech 7, when you first unlock cannons. Within the first few iterations of cannons where they're quite bad, the only real downside to cannons is their price. They're extremely expensive. Even though they are bad, they just freely dish out damage against the enemy from the back row. So the only downside is they're very expensive. Let's pretend that the combat width is 20, okay? And you have a stack of roughly 20 units going in against a stack of roughly 20 units. But in my case, it's a stack of 40 units, 20 of which are cannons, trash low-level cannons. Well, who do you think's going to win? It's going to be the cannon stack, obviously. They're so much more powerful. But the issue is that they are so absurdly expensive, the cannons. And then they go on to just simply becoming more and more and more powerful. But cannons are the meta, guys. I don't know what to say. Cannons are the most powerful unit, to keep it simple. And the fact that mercenary stacks just lack cannons is just outrageous. The next issue with mercenaries is, of course, that they cannot be split up. Meaning that in my case, if we go to my fleets, I have right now about 40 transports per one of my naval fleets. And the reason why is because all of my stacks are composed of 40. Well, we would of course need to have at least 60 transports to transport the mercenaries around, even though the mercenaries constantly take damage even when at peace, unless they're literally just AFK in, look at this, even in Pest, we don't have the supply. AFK in a particularly good supply province, they're going to be damaged. So even though the mercenary is going to end up, being 55 or 40, 52 units as you consolidate them together, they're still going to take 60,000 transports or 60 transports. Absolute garbage. Okay, so this is the situation. I will say that apparently some of these issues have been alleviated in Leviathan, which I'm not currently playing on. But the reason I'm not currently playing on Leviathan is because everything else has not been alleviated, but actually made worse. I'm very disappointed with that patch in general. So some of the stuff might not be applicable to that. But that answers the question, why do we not use mercenaries? Because they're absolutely terrible. I will say, lastly, that if you look around, you will notice that the AI drills their armies. And some of the AI is sitting around at peace, guys, for a long time, drilling their armies. And mercenaries, of course, cannot be drilled. So they're already weaker than your regular units, but they're even more weaker than it might appear because they do not have the drill modifier either. And you will find yourself very often, whether you know it or not, fighting opponents who are drilled up. And of course, your mercenaries cannot drill up. The best use of them, if you do have them, is to basically rebel suppress, because you can't turn the maintenance down either. So they're very expensive despite being terrible. And that's why we don't use mercenaries very often at all. Even when something is bad in this game, guys, you can often still find a use for it. So I will throw it out there. Just because they're quote-unquote bad doesn't mean you will never use mercenaries. But they're terrible, and we do not use them often. I hope that this video was informative and that you guys learned something. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.